All right. So welcome to Talking to Data Equity on Friday, May 27th. And I am so glad you're here. So many familiar faces and new faces, which are so exciting. And essentially, bottom line is Talking Data Equity is an hour that is open to anyone who's interested in data equity. And basically, we spend time talking about the practice of data equity, how to practically get things done in the data equity world. And sometimes we have specific topics, and sometimes we have guests. And today we have a guest, and I'm so excited that she managed to find time in her very productive and busy schedule. I've known Brittany for a while and have been a big fan of her thoughts and her work for a long time. So I want to introduce you to Brittany Rabb. She is a social worker turned researcher who is passionate about centering equity and trauma-informed practices into applied research, data analytics, and continuous improvement processes. Brittany has occupied many spaces, most notably as a school social worker, technical assistance provider, and data analyst conducting educational research in the District of Columbia, which I believe is where she's coming to us from right now. And Brittany is going to spend some time talking with us about things she's learned when applying her expertise at embedding equity and using qualitative research to serve historically marginalized populations. And because there are a lot of people here today, which is fantastic, we're going to ask you to stay muted while Brittany talks. But if you have any questions that you want anybody, Brittany or anybody else, to address, put them into this chat, put them into the Zoom chat, and we will get to them in a live Q&A after Brittany does a short presentation. And if you want to ask a question or make a comment, but you don't want to do it publicly, you can just private chat me, and I will ask your question out loud so the group can hear it. All right. So thank you, Brittany. Over to you.
All right, let me get my slides shared. I haven't been on Zoom in a while. I use Teams, so hopefully you all can see my screen.
We can see your screen great. Yep.
Okay. Can you still, okay. And then if I present, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Well, thank you for having me, Heather. I am so excited to be here and talk about the interdisciplinary emerging and implied framework that I use to ensure that equity is embedded in qualitative research conducted in diverse settings. And so I'm going to give you kind of the lay of the land of what we're going to be talking about today. Today, I will start with the best practice of defining our terms. I don't want to assume that anybody is familiar with these terms. I want to make sure you understand where I'm coming from when I'm using them. And then I will share a little bit about the work that I've done, the steps to successfully embedding equity in qualitative research, and how to integrate a trauma-informed lens into qualitative research as well. I've labeled the middle section of this presentation the basics remixed to honor the fact that I won't be sharing much that is particularly new, but I will hopefully share it in a way that brings into light a new way to think about some traditional components of research. After that, I'll provide some practical examples, and of course, we'll leave time for the meaningful conversation and the challenging questions I know you all will throw at me. So first, I want to start with the definition of terms. So I'm going to take a page out of Heather's book and use the definition she uses of equity and data in the We All Count data equity trainings. So we're thinking of step-by-step processes to avoid racism, sexism, and homophobia, and more in data analysis. And then when I'm thinking about qualitative research, I'm using a really colloquial, conventional like definition. So I'm thinking about the inquiry into humans' experiences and perceptions. I'm using that for usability and accessibility today. If you're really interested in geeking out on why this is such a hard thing to define, I have an additional reading for you at the end. And then when we're thinking about historically marginalized populations, I'm dividing this up based on how this has looked in my work and based on the populations who have been impacted by the work that I do. So I'm thinking of groups of people in a society that, due to racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia, have lost power in that society. That could be political power, that can be disparate financial resources, that can be being pushed to the margin socially. In my work, this might mean African descendants of slaves, Black individuals, African-American individuals, those who are considered impoverished based on certain like study or program eligibility rules, for example. Individuals who identify as a woman, as a part of the LGBTQIA+ community, individuals who have experienced homelessness or who have touched the child welfare system, or any intersection of these or any other identity or population that has been marginalized in a society. This is going to be different for you than it is for me. So throughout this presentation, I ask that you think about how these practices could work for the people that you serve. And last but not least, I want to define the word trauma. And I'm defining it today as an experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. And this is actually the most basic definition of trauma that you can find in anywhere from like Merriam-Webster all the way to like the trauma practice in the United Kingdom. We will not be talking about specific types of trauma, but instead we're going to be talking about how to design research in such a way that is responsive to the needs of those who have experienced it. If you're interested in learning more about trauma and how it impacts the body and all of that, I've included an additional reading about that as well. So now that we have set the stage, I'm going to formally introduce myself. So Heather said a little bit about me, but I just want to add that my name is Brittany Rabb. I use she, her pronouns, and I bring to this discussion my experiences and perspectives as a biracial Black woman. I'm a licensed social worker, particularly a school social worker in the state of Ohio, which is where I'm from, not where I live. And everything you hear from me today will be deeply rooted in the core components of the social work profession. Heather shared a little bit about some of the other things that I've done, and I will not be tying the experiences and examples that I talked through today back to specific organizations, but more so to specific settings in order to honor the privacy and sensitive nature of equity work in qualitative research. So I am going to start with talking about basically the building blocks of my work. How did I get here? What does this work look like? I want to start off by exposing you all to, one, remind you like what is considered qualitative research, and so that you can get to know me a little bit better. Yeah, go ahead.
Brittany, I'm going to pause for 1 second. I know that you said you're usually presenting in teams. This isn't really a problem, but I want to make sure that we're
you can see my notes.
We can see your notes.
Yeah.
That is not a problem at all. But if you don't want us to see your notes,
yeah. That's what I was worried about. Here, 1 second.
It's not a problem, but I'm not sure it's your preferred.
It is not. It is not. Hold on. So you can't see anything, correct?
Right now we can't see anything. That's right.
That's good. Okay. And then I want to present.
And there's no rush at all.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
It's not a problem. There's so many different online platforms and every single one is different. It's no worries at all. Now I think if you,
just hit the present.
Let's try that and see what happens.
Can you see my notes again?
Yeah, that's what we had. So you would think that presenting would be that, but it is not.
I'm so sorry for the technical issues, everyone.
Honestly, it's no problem at all.
Here, I can.
Yeah, that might be it.
Yeah.
So now we can see your main screen and we can see a small, like just thumbnails of the slides going down the left, but we can see your full screen now. So if that works for you, does that work okay for you?
That is fine with me. Yeah.
Okay, let's go.
Sorry, everyone. Yeah, no, thank you for stopping me. I was worried that was the case, but okay, it's okay.
It's more than okay. It's completely fine.
So I'm gonna start with my building blocks because I'm still hoping to help you all get to know me a little bit about what this work as applied qualitative researcher looks like. And so before I dive into that part, though, I want to share a little bit about what I mean about applied. In applied research, researchers try to find immediate solutions to existing problems facing a society, industry, or business organization with the goal of directly influencing practice. This could mean that instead of working extremely hard to publish your work in an academic journal, you might be working really closely with the director of an agency to change policy guidance, influence funding streams, or change agency norms. My experiences in this field range from conducting solo interviews to mixed method studies to focus groups to content analyses and more. Specifically, I've led the development of outreach materials for interviews with school officials on their experiences with data submission during the pandemic, led some interviews focused on high impact tutoring, I have designed 2 qualitative studies. One focused on best practices for including and respecting a child's preference in the education decision-making in the child welfare system. I've also led a qualitative study on the assessment of school administrators' perceptions of demographic change and school funding policies in an inner-ring suburb. I've led focus groups, so some community focus groups on the resident experience of demographic change in an inner-ring suburb, as well as focus groups trying to get the perspectives of young parents to incorporate their views in a systems redesign project. I've also coached people on how to do this. I've coached large foundations and human services agencies on how to embed this as a continuous improvement processes so that we can be doing the work internally that we are doing externally. And I've also engaged in content analyses, most recently, a content analysis of school discipline policies during the pandemic. And I've also engaged in mixed methods work as well. And so in almost all of these experiences, I've been the person to conceptualize the study, lead the development of materials, analysis, and dissemination. So I'm happy to talk about all of these, none of these, but I just want to give you an understanding of where I'm coming from. So let's dive in to the basics remix. All of my experience have informed change on the local level and have given me a front row seat to the best ways to incorporate equity in research that is happening in diverse settings, with diverse populations and with professionals who have a variable understanding of research and equitable practices. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what I've found to be successful as I strive to make sure qualitative research works for the communities that we're receiving their data from. So here are the steps to success. I've identified 4. They're of course not all of the ways, but they're the ones that work for me. And these are things that I regularly use across settings and across populations. They're typically the things that people rarely think about, and they make or break the extent to which qualitative research is used in diverse settings and advances efforts to create a more equitable world. I try to employ these at the beginning of any effort to conduct research, or as a solution when a problem is presented, but often they are not heard or validated until others have exhausted inequitable options. This is just a part of this work, as I'm sure all of you understand. And so step 1 that I have here is advocacy. Qualitative research is not the norm, but it is a critical way to elevate diverse stories and perspectives. Organizations and people within them need innovative equity advocates to suggest qualitative approaches that go against their status quo. In order for the rest of these steps to happen, you have to be using qualitative research. So that's why this is step 1. Next up, we have intentionality. So we have to have attention to the impact of historic and present marginalization, and it must be an active part of all stages of research. Equitable research is a process, not an accidental, convenient outcome. A lot of time I hear people who are like, oh, this just happened to work for this population, or this happened to really benefit these people. And it's just like, if it sounds like you lucked into it, there was no intentionality from the beginning. And so that's, you got to pay attention to how people talk about things. And so you also have to have integrity as well. We generally think of integrity as what you do when people aren't watching, right? And so qualitative research deserves the same level of rigor as quantitative research. And we have to embed equitable principles regardless of the level of oversight or publicity of research and results. When we're talking about applied research, this can be a one-off study internally to improve a practice, or it can be a national study. Both deserve the same level of rigor. And then my encouragement to you all coming from my social work background is to be trauma informed. Be considerate about how each aspect of the research process might be experienced by a survivor of trauma. And look for ways to include as many aspects of the trauma-informed framework into that research process. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. But first, there are 2 things I want to clarify. Being equitable does not mean that you're inherently being trauma-informed. There are many components of being trauma-informed that would benefit people from historically marginalized groups, given the community trauma we know they have experienced. However, being trauma-informed does not mean that you're inherently being equitable. Stay with me here. Individuals who are not a part of historically marginalized communities can experience trauma, and that is absolutely important to account for in your research design. However, just being trauma-informed and mindful of that does not mean that you are doing what you need to do to ensure this work is equitable. My point by including this is that it is something that can advance equity in combination with these other steps, not something that is inherently an equity-based practice in and of itself. Because we are starting to think of ways to be trauma-informed in this space when conducting research, I want to spend a little time describing what this could look like. Keep in mind, this is only one step of the equity puzzle. And on this slide, I actually want to start with a quote from Heather. So in the foundations of data equity training from We All Count, Heather says, data collection is a very relational and social activity. And that is what the heart of this approach is about, right? We are talking people to people, we are engaging with humans, and that is what matters. And so everything that I'm about to say is about how to make the best process and the best experience for people as they engage in research, especially if they have experienced trauma or come from a historically marginalized population. And so on the slide, you can see the 6 components of the trauma-informed framework. They come from the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration in the US. The text around each of the circles describes my recommendations for incorporating each principle into research. So first, we're going to start with safety. We have to consider the impact of the physical and virtual environment, and we have to treat consent as a continual process. So when we're thinking about environment, we need to understand that if you are interviewing somebody in a child welfare agency, what does that signal for them, right? What is that reminding them of? What is that bringing their body back to? That's so important to remember, right? And we find ourselves getting frustrated, like, why don't they want to talk to me? Why don't they want to talk to me? Well, like, look at your settings. like, do you want to talk? No. And so that's so important to remember. And it can also go down to this chair or that chair. It can go down to, can I see, as a trauma survivor, can I see the door? If we're in depending on the space that we're in, like, I don't want my back to the door. Like, those are all things that people experience that can make their experience of the research more comfortable. And same with the virtual environment too. We've had to learn how to do that. But there are things around how to use cameras and how you don't, and the levels of privacy people have in that way, and the level of safety that they're able to experience. And same with treating consent as a continual process, right? We all know that you're supposed to do informed consent, right? This is the basics part of the basics remix. But it has to be a continual process, right? It's not like for a survivor of trauma, that one time is not enough. And that has to feel like an ongoing experience of consent, not just a one-time checkbox. And so moving on to trustworthiness and transparency, we have to create consistent and predictable ways of engaging with participants. They need to know that you're not going to email them in the middle of the night. Like, they need to know when to expect communications from you, right? Just because you're working late does not mean that that your inconsistencies should impact them, because we have to think about what that does to the brain and body and what you as a researcher or a person from an agency or whatever are representing to them. We also have to be transparent about who will see and use the data. We do this, once again, another basic, but if you're asking somebody to share a very sensitive part of themselves, like, you need to be as specific as possible about how the data is going to be used, who's going to see it, the impact on that, and the fact that we also want to the extent possible, tell people that it's not going to impact their employment, their relationship with the agency, all of that. And all of that is basic, but it's so important for somebody who has lost power in a traumatic experience. And we also want to think about peer support. This is probably one of the trickiest ones to do as a researcher. It involves validating, empathizing, and normalizing the participant's experience as appropriate, right? When you've experienced trauma, you feel like you stand out, you feel like you're broken. And so it's really important that we are able to create an empathetic space when we're engaging in research to the extent appropriate. But there's still a power dynamic there at the end of the day. I'm not obscuring that. And so the second point is we have to respect the participant's need for peer comfort or the support of a trusted person, right? We might have a strong desire to get a student alone and talk to them about something that we don't want to hear from their parents about, right? It might be really important to your study design. However, that participant's comfort and not re-triggering them by being alone, if there's a gender dynamic that is triggering to them, that and making them feel comfortable is more important than that. And that's what I have found in order to make sure that the research process is a comfortable process for people. And then when thinking about collaboration and mutuality, we want to level our power differences, we want to share decision-making, and we want to respect the choices and expertise of participants. All things that sound nice, all things that I'm sure people in this community would agree with. But it looks different. We have to walk the walk and talk the talk, and we have to take it a step farther by understanding, one, how is a trauma survivor going to see the world? How do they understand power? How is power understood when it's been taken away? How can we go the extra mile to make sure our space is set up in a way that levels the power? How can we dress in such a way that levels that? and minimizes triggers. And I know we always say we should respect the choice of people, but if a person makes a choice or something and our demeanor says something and offers a demeanor of rejection somehow, or shock or surprise, that is not respecting it. You're respecting in your head, but not in your nonverbals. So that's kind of everything that's going into this trauma-informed lens, is not just the words that come out of our mouths, but how we do it. And then when we're thinking about empowerment, voice, and choice, we want to create opportunities for choices at all sizes, at all stages of research, right? Anything down from like, do you want to participate, how, when, and where, to this chair or that chair? All of those decisions matter. And we also want to view voice as an ongoing process, not the outcome. And this is something that I see with qualitative research a lot. We want to promote voice, right? But voice is not a trophy. It is not something to achieve necessarily. It is a process, right? And so that's something you have to keep in mind too. And then last but not least, cultural, historical, and gender issues. We have to ensure all members of the research team are aware of current and historical issues of the participants. And so here I'm going to talk about what happened in the US this week, like with the mass shooting in Texas, right? If you're already planning research in that space or in any school in the US, going into that space without acknowledging that would not be being trauma informed. You might have had a 1-hour interview planned, but this week is the week that's going to be a 3-hour interview. Like it just is, we have to be okay with that and flexible with that. And this looks the same for various historically marginalized populations as well, because you have to be in touch with what happened in their community. There could have been a shooting in a community. There could have been a loss of somebody, of a political figure, something that means something to that community, and you have to be aware of those things. That's going to take training, right? And that is the intentionality and integrity piece, right? If you're going to train quantitative researchers on survey and tools and all of that, we have to be trained qualitative researchers on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And we have to have diverse research teams in order for this last point to really thrive. And at the end of the day, you're not going to do it perfectly. So we have to have humility and hold space. That's what I mean by that 1-hour interview is not a 3-hour interview, and you have to hold that space. And the key takeaway here is that there is more to promoting voice than just the outcome of the research. You don't want the research participants to share their voice, but look at the whole process and think that they were not empowered, had no choice, and their voice was just being extracted from them without sensitivity. And so now I'm gonna hopefully make this real for you all before we're hopping into our conversation. And so I've kind of reversed the steps to success and offered some experiences that I've had and some solutions for them when we're talking about this kind of work. So because we're just talking about trauma, we're gonna start with that one. So I've had the experience where we're designing a qualitative study and we're gonna ask students in a K-12 setting about a type of experience that was not enjoyable or would generally be understood to be not enjoyable. There are incentives, $20 gift cards in particular, and no participants signed up. Recruitment didn't work. Nobody wants to talk, right? Students and families don't want to talk. And I've had an agency leader say to me, I don't understand why people don't want to engage in our study. Like, I have no clue why these people don't want to talk to us. And I want us to think that through a little bit, right? Think through the ways in which the topic of study, the physical environment, or the historical relationship with the researchers and institutions might dissuade people from participation, right? If you wouldn't want to talk about it, they don't want to talk about it, And so that's what we have to keep in mind and really humanize that. Like, of course they don't want to talk to us about this, right? And so the question is, how can we make this more comfortable and ensure that we're making a safe space and respect the fact that this might not be a good time for a certain community to engage in this work. And that might be more important than what you would have learned in the study anyways. If somebody is not wanting to engage with you, that is telling. And so that might be an area for you to lean into and pause the study. I know there are funding implications and all of that. However, this is what we need to do in order to make research a safe process for people in historically marginalized communities. And at the end of this, be okay with it. Like, you have to be okay with it. Don't be hard on yourself. Like, you just have to learn from it and grow. No anger is needed. No frustration is needed. Like, we just have to humanize people and realize that they have a right to say no, and that's okay. And that's what we want in some respects. Moving on to integrity, I've heard this qualitative work is IRB exempt. Therefore, we do not have to do informed consent. And this goes back to the fact that, like, regardless of the level of oversight, researchers and practitioners should treat all aspects and all types of research with rigor, care, and consideration. Doesn't matter if you're being watched. If you were going to do, if the IRB was a part of this and you were going to do this beautifully long informed consent, you were going to have all these checks in place, those should exist, right? Those people still deserve that. And so that's kind of what I'm saying here. And then when we're talking about intentionality, I can't tell you the number of times I have heard someone say to me, qualitative research is just talking to people. Focus groups are just a group conversation. It's the just, right? Where we minimize it, one, as a methodology, but two, we're also minimizing people, right? We're just chatting to them, like as if that's not important and they're not taking the time to speak with us and we're not profiting off of that and using their data to advance our careers. Like that's so important to keep in mind. And so we have to prepare as if we would regardless and be intentional and use analysis techniques and invest in the same way that we would with quantitative research. And then the last piece, back to the beginning, is advocacy. And so we have to be using qualitative practices in order to talk about any of this. And what I have found in my experience is that you can advocate for the use of qualitative practices when there is an absence of or gap in quantitative data. I'm going to put a big old asterisk on this though, right? I'm not treating qualitative research as the backup plan to quantitative research, but I am also, I've lived in the realities of like organizations who just don't do this, right? This is new, right? So you have to find gaps in order to advocate for the use of this. And that is unfortunate, but that is the reality. So this is a really real and concrete point. You have to find meaningful and authentic ways to conduct qualitative analyses to ensure that diverse perspectives are elevated. And that's only step one. And you can't have step one without step two. Step two is create a sustainability plan to adopt that practice moving forward. You should not be pitching the use of this for one time. It has to be an ongoing plan, assuming all goes well. But at the end of the day, we're highlighting stories, and that is not something that you only do one time. And so that is the end of my super preachy, but very passionate and very, I hope, meaningful thoughts on how to embed equity and qualitative research. I have included some additional readings here, some that talk about qualitative research, some that talk about trauma, some that talk about equity, some that talk about the intersection of them. Dig in, find your own resources. These are things that have worked for me. And my encouragement to you all is to use one of these or one concept from today and start small, because if you wait for perfection in order to get started, you never will start. So I want to thank you all for listening to me and dealing with the tech issues at the beginning. My email is here and I'm happy to continue these conversations outside of this space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brittany. That was indeed incredibly useful, incredibly practical, and very, very inspiring. And just loved everything you said. I have a long list of questions I want to ask, but before I monopolize the space with my questions, this is the time for you all who are here to get an opportunity to ask your questions. We have a few people who submitted questions in advance because they couldn't be here today. So I have a couple of advanced questions. But if you are here today and you want to ask a question, this is the time when, if you want to raise your hand, you can. And by raising your hand, I mean down in the Zoom menu bar, there's an option called reactions. It's a smiley face with a little plus on its head. And if you click that, one of the options says raise your hand. So if you want to raise your hand, you can raise your hand, and then we'll unmute you and you can ask your question out loud. If you don't want to do that, put your question into the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and you can't figure out the Zoom way to raise your hand, just put in the chat that you want to raise your hand, and then we will. Excellent. So there is a question. If you could recommend one thing, because I really, really loved how you ended on, choose one thing. Don't wait to be perfect. If you could recommend one thing that researchers should read to be more enlightened in this area, what would it be? What's your desert island read for this one?
So, because I think I'm gonna make an assumption here that I'm going to choose something that's going to be not methodologically focused, right? If you're a researcher, are you doing some of the work? I'm going to assume some like familiarity with some of the qualitative side. And I would encourage you to read something more on the trauma social work side. And it would be The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. It doesn't talk about like research and incorporating into all of what I just talked about, but it puts you inside the head of a person who has experienced trauma and what it has done to their body and why. It gives you the why we should do this. And that is why I would choose that.
I was so excited to see that on your list of bibliography because I recommend that book so highly as well. I resonate, and I know I'm in Toronto, and I know for sure that the Toronto Public Library has ebook copies, audiobook copies, and physical copies. So if you don't have the cash, because there are lots of ways to get access to that book in a lot of different formats, and I reread it on a regular basis because trauma-informed work isn't only needed for qualitative research. It's also needed for quantitative research. I mean, I think if we're going to train quantitative researchers on survey design, we also need to be training quantitative researchers on these things. Like, they're critical for the qualitative work, and they are critical for the quantitative work too. If you're asking somebody to take a survey or asking somebody to participate in a focus group, you're still forming a relationship. And just like you say, I like your thing of, well, it's qualitative data, so we don't need an IRB. I thought the kind of like the quantitative version of that, it's quantitative data. We don't have to worry about being trauma informed. And I'm like, absolutely not. Like, all of these things really, really matter. Okay, there's a lot of questions coming in directly to me on a similar topic, which is consent. Because I do think all researchers really, really struggle with consent, and especially consent with young people, because usually you need consent from a parent, but sometimes just trying to get consent from a parent can be traumatizing. And so one of the questions I'll amplify is, do you have a specific example of how to gain consent in an ongoing way through the process? Like, what does that look like if you try and do that?
Yeah, so you can't be in everybody's head, right? Like, some of this requires a level of reading of people. And so I think it's a lot of reading of nonverbal cues, right? We can see how a question hits somebody. We can see discomfort. We can see like there's a difference between stuttering or like not giving an answer because you're thinking versus like, that hit me, I didn't expect that, like a little defensiveness. So it involves reading people and watching how each question hits them and acknowledging it. Don't just keep going. You say, do you need a minute? Do you need a break? Do you still want to do this? As a reminder, you don't have to answer that. That's consent on an ongoing way. It doesn't have to be consent for the entire engagement, but consent in that moment. You don't have to answer that. And then they're able to make a choice, because at that point, especially if they're being triggered, that initial consent that they did at the beginning has gone out their head. So it's important to read people and their nonverbals.
Yeah, that is such an important thing to do. And also, if you're like conducting a quantitative survey, we do that informed consent thing at the beginning, but I have never seen, and that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I have never seen a quantitative survey that asks again in the middle, even, even in like gender-based violence research and things like that, or the violence research that we were talking about last Friday with Marika. I wonder what it would look like to ask for consent more than once. I mean, of course we say prefer not to say, but that's a little bit different than specifically saying, remember that you don't have to keep answering this survey.
Definitely. And I think something that I've done with surveys too, because my job is currently quantitative, so I can speak on that too.
Yeah, like, of course you can.
You know that. I was saying that for everybody else. And so for surveys, one thing, especially if you do like a quick like Google form, I don't know how you're doing, but if you're doing it in one of the less formal ways, the impact of having a required question versus not, that is a revocation of like, there's a consent issue there where you cannot advance if you don't answer this question. And so I encourage people to be very mindful of that, because that's where the the feeling of being trapped, right? I can't get past this. Why do I have to answer that? Like, you can put people off from that. Like, you can avoid that situation. So that's one of the more concrete ways that I encourage people to be trauma informed in their surveys. Like, I'm sorry if you really need that question to be answered, but people also need choice.
That is such a good example. That's a great example. Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, here's another question. Does avoiding collecting data from people who are recently traumatized privilege the perspective and data from people who are less or non-traumatized because it might be easier, safer, or trauma-informed to collect? So that's kind of like an opportunity. Like, how do we think about the opportunity curve on trying to understand and amplify and elevate and collect data from people who've experienced trauma versus not out of respect from the trauma?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think I can highlight two, like, my steps to success here. One is the advocacy, right? I don't agree with taking the easy way out. That's number one. But when it comes to advocacy, if you are in an agency or a part of a study that's saying we're not going to engage with this population because it's too hard, because we know what they have been through, and they're saying we're not going to engage, that's an advocacy moment for you to say, we can do it, we just have to do it well. And a part of doing it well is step 4, which is the trauma-informed practice, right? That is the way, that is the how. The answer is to not engage, is to make sure that the process is respectful of what a person has gone through.
Yeah, I really, really like that example. That's a really good idea. What are your thoughts? I'm going to circle back because there's a lot of questions about consent. I'm going to circle back about who, in terms of consent with young people, because of some of the examples you had were with young people. Do you always get consent for parents, and at what age? And of course, I'm not asking you to talk about your specific work, but just your opinions, unrelated to any specific project. What are your thoughts about consent in young people and parents?
Yeah, so there's definitely formalities, right? Most agencies or IRBs or all that are going to require parental consent. There's so many problems in that, right? Because a parent can consent and then the kid might not be okay. And so that's going to be, I'm going to assume that unfortunately has to be step 1. But when you get into the interactions with the child, the beauty of assent is still checking in with the child, and you all can have a best practice or like a requirement as a research team that if you're starting to see uncomfortability with a child, if they are starting to say, I'm not going to answer this, I don't want to engage, you can have a practice that says you don't force them to engage just because their parent consented to them. The parent said yes, that they can do it. They didn't say that you have to answer every single question, right? You have flexibility as a research team there to embed some of these principles. And you can give breaks, you can embed breaks. Like, there's so many ways that after the parental consent piece, you can work on getting child assent along the way, or just be able to say, okay, the kid doesn't want to do it. Here is your incentive, right? You showed up, you came into this space, you took the time to come here, you still get your incentive. So I think those are some of the things that I would say. You have space after parental consent.
Okay, that's really, really useful. Do you have direct experience with the types of incentives that might be also trauma informed? Because I used to be personally like a huge advocate for cash all the time. It should only be cash. It should be non-traceable, non-connected to any kind of, but in the past couple of years, I've learned a lot more about the problems with that, and that there was some very serious unintended consequences associated with handing out cash as incentives. Have you had experiences with trauma-informed incentives? You've mentioned gift cards. Do you use those? Like, you find they work?
I don't think they work. I don't think they go in particular. I lean on the side of valuing people's time, that there should be an incentive. Like that's where I often find my advocacy, because I'm in a lot of space that, due to funding reasons, especially if you're in a small agency, that you are not offering incentives, especially with the typical gift card. And so I'm usually at that level of the fight, like, at least we should do that. And so I haven't been able to get past that to think about this to think about what is the impact of handing cash to somebody? What does that remind them of? What does that
Mhm.
take them to, especially if we're thinking about gender-based violence and or anything like that? I
Yep.
think you have to know your population. And that's where kind of like the cultural, historical, and gender issues part of the trauma-informed framework comes from. My thing is like, if you know
Yeah.
something is going to be triggering for a certain population based on research or whatever, just don't do that. I know that's not super helpful, but I think that's the intentionality piece that it's never going to be perfect, but people will feel the intentionality versus just handing
Yeah.
them cash.
Yeah, yeah. And also what we learned was handing cash created vulnerability where it didn't necessarily exist. You know, you depends on where they're going next. If they have all of a sudden cash in their hands that people around them don't necessarily have in their pockets, it sets up a whole nother level of confusion.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, do you have examples and or advice on how to authentically share power and decision making with families or students in a school district? It's a really common question because we struggle. For example, I have observed superficial involvement of families with reviews of curricular resources because we, the district staff, often have seen ourselves as the experts on curriculum and aren't always clear on what to seek authentic family voice on.
One of my biggest things, and this goes back to the choice piece in the trauma-informed framework, is don't offer false choice. That is actually one of the most damaging things and re-traumatizing things that you can do. So I think this person's nod to saying like we don't want to include them where their voice isn't actually wanted. I think that's important. You can check your district later on, like why don't we want their voice? Like that's a separate advocacy issue. But in the moment, like a person needs to like the feeling of giving your voice, being told that it's going to be used, and then having it not, that's what you want to avoid. So being intentional. And so if you're engaging with parents and families, you can say to them, this is what you're giving feedback on, and this is what we can't really change. And I think people respond really well to that, right? They respond well to the transparency of you telling them in advance, we can't fix this, but I'm really hoping you can help me with this. And then I also think back to kind of like the incentives piece, being respectful of like, if you're going to ask for people to participate in a 4-part working group, you need to compensate them appropriately or ask them like, okay, what are you missing out on right now to be here? And I think that one, it signals that you care. And two, it levels power differences, right? Like their perspective is a valuable one that requires incentives, payments, all of that. And so I think those are important concepts to keep in mind that I've actually used with children who have youth who have experienced homelessness, right? And they come back and do advocacy, and we pay them and we give them health insurance sometimes and all of those things to make them feel like a valuable part of the team, not just a one-off engagement.
Right. Oh, that is a great example. And I really, really like the most important thing to do is be honest. Like false power sharing is worse than just being transparent about no power sharing. And I so strongly agree with that. It makes many, many organizations very uncomfortable. They would rather pretend to share power. But I have had similar experiences to you, that being crystal clear about these are the parts that we can change. And also in that, I usually try and give space for like, and we're going to leave a little bit of space for you to talk about all the things we should be listening to you change about, but with the complete transparency that right now we don't have the power to change that. Or else sometimes the tensions are just, I mean, because there's a lot of problems.
Yeah.
I can imagine that there is a spectrum of how trauma informed someone can be, like anything you can learn. How do you know when you're out of your depth in terms of being able to be trauma informed for a certain project? What are some warning signs? When should you pause or maybe just stop a project if you think you're in over your head? Oh, that's a great question.
That's a good question. We're process that for a minute.
Yeah, no, yeah, take your time. You're not in the hot seat. It's just a conversation.
No, it's just
because
exciting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna speak to the spectrum piece first. But that's why I said pick something, right? It's a 6-part, like there's 6 components of it, right? There might be one time where you just try to focus on safety. There might be one study that you really drill in on. What do our physical spaces feel and look like? And you might start there as a way to help your team not be overwhelmed. Like if you all say like, hey, I heard this girl talk about all of these things that we should be doing, people are going to get overwhelmed. But if you say, why don't we talk about the safety of our physical environment when we do interviews or surveys? That feels more tangible. And then you'll see along the way that like, oh, we're thinking about this. Oh, why don't we talk about, you're already being intentional, right? Like some of these things will start to fall in, and then you might think about peer comfort automatically if you're starting from one spot. So I do think that taking one part of the trauma informed framework as a way to dig in is completely okay. You don't have to start with the whole thing. But if you're finding, it's kind of like with the example that I gave where like you're through recruitment and you have no participants. You have to, I mean, they're making you pause, which is good, but like you might find another situation where like you might have participants and all of them might be leaving your office crying. That's a sign like we got to stop. We're not doing something right. We're not creating a safe space or whatever. Right. And so I think taking the cues from your participants is the best way to know when you're in over your head. And that is the reading of people. That is the learning about how trauma survivors experience the world, how the historically marginalized community views the world. That's why all of that is important, so that you know when to stop and when to go.
Yeah. And that does circle back to the body keeps score, because I think that will help a person achieve exactly what you're describing, is how to know the red flags in yourself and in them, how to interpret, because so much of a trauma response, it doesn't look like it might if a person is talking about a topic that doesn't remind them of trauma or re-traumatize them. And so you can't try and just experience everything linearly or be like, that doesn't make any rational sense. Of course it doesn't make rational sense. That's the point.
Yeah.
It does make rational sense as soon as you put it in the context, then it does make rational sense of like, yes, that's a very rational response to a trauma.
Yeah, and to your point, Heather, it's that kind of goes back to like, it doesn't have to be always a re-traumatizing topic, right? Like the process, engagement, the relationship piece, like that's also where it can be happening. So that's something I wanted to add to your point. But then I also think that if the person who asks the question, or any of you are people who have a level of power in your agencies and your research teams or anything like that, you have the stop and go sign too when it comes to the culture on your team. Like if you're hearing some of the red flags of like, oh, we're just talking to people, what's the big deal? That's a red flag, right? That your interviewers are not going to go out and engage with people in the way that you need to be engaging with them. So team or agency culture is also a signal for this as well.
Yeah, really, really good point. That's true. That's such a good point. I hadn't thought of that. That's a really, really good point. How your team is talking and relating internally is probably another really good diagnostic for how ready are we to deal with this in a trauma-informed way. Because if you can't do it internally, there's no way you can do it with anybody that you might bring into the process.
Yeah. One more thing I'll add on that, like for how this might look, especially if we're talking about schools or students or communities, especially if we're talking about segregated spaces in the US in particular. And if you have a primarily white dominated research team, you'll start to hear this come out a lot when we're talking about going and traveling to meet people for interviews, or going into schools and doing like visiting sites, right? Going to the people. And you'll hear the embedded racism come out. You'll hear those side of the tracks, that side of the city. I don't know what I'm going to do with my car. Like you'll hear that in your research team, that's like your locker room talk kind of, and so that's something important as a leader to be tapping into. If I'm hearing all my researchers say that they're really anxious about going to a certain place, which is in some ways valid, based in challenging things, but sometimes valid, and it's a real fear that they're experiencing. But that is a stop sign. That is, we got to talk about this. Do we need a meeting? Do we need to pause and think through our approach better? Do we need to send a buddy team? Whatever, but it's a stop sign. So that's another thing.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's so correct. And it's something that is, I think, really common and does get kind of glossed over. That's definitely a stop sign. Thank you for bringing that up. That's true. And I also want to circle back to the thing you said about it, the topic doesn't have to be traumatizing. Just being in a relationship, being in a data collection relationship, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, can be traumatizing. And I think that was so helpful for me as well, because I can get caught in that thing of like, well, the topic, if it's not gender-based violence or whatever, but yeah, I'm so glad that you added that extra insight, because that really, really resonates with me, that relationships, it doesn't matter the topic, but relationships all need to be handled in a trauma-informed way. Adding so many insights to my Friday. Thank you so much. A lot of questions are coming in. We're not going to get to them all. We probably have time for one more. Are you okay to answer one more?
Absolutely. I can.
Okay, great. There's a lot. How do you advocate for incorporating trauma-informed research practices as best practices for data collection within your organization when you don't work with populations whose primary identity is experienced trauma? Great question. Should I repeat that?
Nope, I got it.
Okay. It's such a good question.
My first push on that, to not you, the person who wrote it, but to whoever you're talking to, my first push on that is the assumption you don't know who's experienced trauma. As I said, right. That's anybody. That is not something that is only experienced by historically marginalized population. You can't see it on me. You can't. And so you need to, like your push to them in your advocacy to them is to say, like, we should assume that everybody has or knows someone. We should assume that. We should operate from that, because it's not necessarily an identity, but it's something that humans experience every day, unfortunately. And so that would be my push there. And you can advocate for it as a best practice because, and you can advocate for it as an interdisciplinary practice as well, right? A lot of people like to grow and learn from other fields, so that's a little spin I like to put on it every now and again. And I think that there's enough research behind it too that says, like, this is just the best way to engage with humans, not even if they haven't experienced trauma, right? Like, who wouldn't want to have a safe environment, right? Even if you haven't experienced trauma. So I think it's just like you can pitch it as a way to engage with humans, not necessarily just a way to engage with those who have experienced trauma. Right.
Yeah. And I really do. And I've been thinking more about this listening to you talk today, that it seems, and correct me if this is wrong, but it seems like in any kind of research, we need to just assume that all research participants and collaborators have experienced trauma and if they haven't, and we're treating them in a trauma-informed way, that's not going to be bad. But if they have, and we're not treating them in a trauma-informed way, that is going to be bad.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just put one less. Yeah, go ahead.
No, my question is, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, and that's like, thank you. I'm happy you brought that up, because like I would like to say, like, one last push I have on this is, right, we think of people experiencing trauma as those outside of us, or as the participants, as the historically marginalized people. Like, that's a bias in and of itself. The person sitting next to you also has experienced that. If the topic might be hard for them to ask the question about, it might be hard for your leader to lead on. So that's why it's also in better practice in organizations too. Staff surveys, feedback surveys, all of those things can have a trauma-informed lens so that you can have a best workforce who is able to do that with the public.
Yeah. Okay. That's a perfect note to end on. Is there's no them in the traumatized population. There's us, there's all of us. And whether you're doing quantitative research or qualitative research, it's really essential to produce rigorous, reliable, robust science to adopt a trauma-informed approach, or else your results aren't going to be useful. And so it's not just a squishy idea if you're like a certain type of person. It's a critical part of producing science. All right. So we will upload this video and link to all of those resources that Brittany so generously curated and shared with us. And I know that we did not get to all your questions, and I apologize for that. You can put your questions in. Can you put a link to the forum? We'll put a link to the forum in the chat where you can continue to ask questions, and where the video will be in a couple of hours. And the forum, the We All Count Data Equity Forum, is free. You don't have to join it at all to be able to read it. If you want to post a comment or post a question, you do have to join it. But by join, all I mean is assign yourself a password. It lives on a We All Count server. So we're not harvesting your data. We're not serving you ads. We're not sharing your data in any way with anyone. So if you want to re-ask a question that didn't get answered here, because we did run out of time, that's the place to do it. And I will make sure that you get a response. Brittany, I cannot thank you enough. This hour flew by. We're definitely going to have to ask you to come back. And your experience is so useful and so practical and so genuinely insightful. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, everyone. Take care.
Okay. Bye, everyone.